My name is Kitty. The courtroom was tense, filled with the heavy silence that precedes a storm. My father, Mr. Thompson, stood at the plaintiff's table, his face contorted with false righteousness. His new wife, Mrs. Thompson, sat behind him, a smug look on her face. My brother, Jake, was in the back row, grinning like a shark ready to feast. My father took the stand and began to speak, his voice steady but laced with venom. Your Honor, my daughter, Kitty, has never held a real job. She takes in foster kids for the money, draining her mother's trust and living off the state. She's heartless and unfit to manage what her mother left behind. I sat at the defense table, my hands folded in my lap. I had practiced anger for months, but as I listened to his lies, I felt nothing. He had lost the right to make me feel anything a long time ago. My lawyer, Miss Harris, placed a sealed federal envelope on the judge's bench. The judge, an elderly woman with a no-nonsense look, opened it and began to read. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the contents. Mr. Thompson, she said, looking directly at my father, do you have any idea why your wife's death certificate is dated weeks before her actual passing? My father's face paled, and his hands began to shake. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. To understand how I ended up in this courtroom, you have to understand my family. My mother, Mrs. Thompson, was a schoolteacher for 30 years. She was a gentle soul, always kind and patient. Every Sunday evening, after dinner, she would sit at the kitchen table and write in her ledger with a red fountain pen. She kept the ink in a small glass bottle on the windowsill. When I was 10, I asked her why she didn't use a computer. She looked at me with her warm eyes and said, "Numbers don't lie, Kitty. People do. Learn to read the numbers, and you'll always find the truth." My father, on the other hand, was a funeral director at Thompson & Sons Funeral Home. He was a cold and calculating man, more concerned with money than with the people he served. He always favored my brother, Jake, who was 6 years older than me. From a young age, my father made it clear that Jake was the heir to the family business. This is Jake, he would say. He's going to take over the firm one day. Then he'd turn to me and say, and this is Kitty. She's a bit of a mystery. I remember my 6th birthday. Jake got a brand new bicycle, while I got a book about nature. My father told the family at dinner that Jake was going to be a success, and I was just his quiet sister. My mother squeezed my hand under the table and gave me a small smile. That night, after my father went to bed, my mother came into my room with a cup of hot cocoa. Some people don't know what to do with quiet girls like you, Kitty. But quiet is a strength. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. I left home at 20 to go to college. I worked part-time at a local hospital, taking care of the elderly. I found that I had a gift for making them feel loved and cared for. In 2018, I completed my certification to become a foster parent. I was excited to start a new chapter in my life, but my father and brother were not supportive. Jake sent me a text saying, "Why would you get involved with other people's problems?" My mother, however, sent me an email saying, "Kitty, I'm so proud of you. You've always had a big heart. Don't let anyone dim your light." In 2020, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, stage 4. The doctor who delivered the news was Dr. Miller, a kind-hearted man who had been recommended by my mother's friend. She had been researching him for weeks. I drove to our family home as soon as I heard the news. My father was at work, and Jake was on a business trip. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her red pen in her hand and an envelope in front of her. "Don't tell your father I told you first," she said. "He needs to think he heard it from the doctor. It keeps him in check." I asked her what she meant, but she just smiled and said, "I'll explain when you're ready." By the end of the summer, my mother was in home hospice. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, but when she was lucid, she was preparing for something. I just didn't know what. One day, the foster care agency called me about a little girl named Lily. Her mother had passed away, and she had no other family. I said yes immediately. Lily and I started spending time together, and I grew to love her like my own daughter. In September, I took her to visit my mother. My mother was sitting up in bed, her face pale but her eyes bright. "Come here, sweetheart," she said to Lily. "Let me read you a story." She read her The Secret Garden, and Lily listened intently. When she was done, my mother took her red pen and wrote in the front of the book, "For Lily, with all my love. Grandma Thompson." A few days later, my mother passed away. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath. After the funeral, when I was cleaning out her bedside table, I found a sealed envelope addressed to me. On the front, in her red ink, it said, "Open this only if your father comes for the trust." I put the envelope in my safe and didn't think about it for a long time. 2 weeks after the funeral, I read the trust my mother had left behind. It was substantial, including the family home, a savings account, and a life insurance policy worth over $1 million. I was the sole trustee. I sent my father an email, asking him to transfer the insurance proceeds into the trust account. He wrote back saying it was already taken care of. I believed him, but looking back, I should have been more suspicious. I forwarded the email to my mother's estate attorney, Ms. Harris. She told me to keep all the emails and documents related to the trust. I started a folder on my computer called Mom and added every piece of evidence I could find. Over the next few years, Jake and my father started to make demands on the trust. Jake called me one day and asked to borrow money. I told him no, citing my fiduciary duty to my mother's wishes. He got angry and said, "You think you're better than us because Mom loved you more. She left you that trust despite Dad." In 2023, my father sent me an email saying he thought a $400,000 distribution from the trust would be appropriate. I wrote back, explaining that the trust principal was protected by my mother's instructions. He didn't respond. Then, on Thanksgiving 2023, everything changed. My father and his new wife, Mrs. Thompson, invited me to their house for dinner. At the table, Mrs. Thompson turned to me and said, "Kitty, I don't understand what you do. You don't seem to have a real job." My father laughed and said, "She just takes in foster kids for the money." I didn't say a word. I just sat there, feeling like an outsider in my own family. I took Lily's hand under the table and left as soon as I could. In 2024, Mrs. Thompson started a blog, where she wrote about grown children who use the vulnerable for financial gain. I knew she was talking about me, but I didn't respond. I just kept collecting evidence. In January 2026, I received a notice of a lawsuit from my father. He was suing me for breach of fiduciary duty, claiming that I had misappropriated funds from the trust. The evidence he presented included fake bank statements and a death certificate that showed my mother had died weeks before she actually did. I drove to the cemetery that night and sat by my mother's grave. I looked at the death certificate in my hand and felt a sense of shock. My father had buried my mother on paper before she even knew she was dying. I called Ms. Harris the next morning. She told me to bring the envelope my mother had left me and the book she had given to Lily. When I got to her office, she showed me the real financial records of the trust. The forgeries were obvious. She also showed me a handwritten medical record from Dr. Miller, dated September 2020, which proved that my mother was alive and being treated long after the fake death certificate was issued. Ms. Harris subpoenaed the insurance company's records and found that the payout of over $1 million had been wired to a joint account my parents held in August 2020, weeks before my mother's actual death. In the following weeks, my father had transferred all the money into his own accounts and a business account owned by Jake. It turned out that Jake had sold my mother the life insurance policy in 2017 and had received a large commission when the claim was paid. He had every reason to wish for an early payout. Ms. Harris also discovered that my mother had filed a preemptive complaint with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service in 2020, suspecting that my father might commit mail fraud related to the insurance policy. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom feeling nervous but determined. I saw my father, Jake, and Mrs. Thompson sitting on the other side. The judge, Judge Wilson, took her seat, and the trial began. After my father and Jake made their false accusations, Ms. Harris presented the evidence. She handed the judge the sealed federal envelope, which contained the verification letter from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. The judge read the letter aloud, and the courtroom fell silent. This letter confirms that Mrs. Thompson filed a predictive complaint in 2020, identifying her husband as likely to commit mail fraud related to her life insurance policy. The evidence has now been authenticated. My father's face turned white, and Jake looked like he was about to bolt. Mrs. Thompson started to cry and admitted that she had signed the false death certificate at my father's request. Judge Wilson dismissed the case with prejudice and referred the matter to the United States Attorney's Office. My father and Jake faced serious legal consequences. After the trial, I used a portion of the insurance money to start a foundation called Thompson's Hope. It provides support and resources for foster parents in our community. Lily is still with me, and she has become an important part of my life. Every morning, when I look at the picture she drew of my mother, I am reminded of the strength and love that my mother had. And I know that she is still watching over us, making sure that justice is served.